Christmas, the season of joy, the wonder of the incarnation, and the New York Times dropping its annual lump of coal on Christians. This year they've teamed up with Ivy League scholar Elaine Pagels to push the idea that Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, but was the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier named Panthera, maybe even the result of rape. Yep, they really went there. Merry Christmas, fundies. Let's unpack why this claim crumbles faster than a gingerbread house in a hailstorm. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times highlights Pagels' claim that early sources called Jesus the son of a Roman soldier named Panthera, asking how we should evaluate this alleged evidence. To that, Pagels responds, yes, these stories circulated after Jesus' death among members of the Jewish community who regarded him as a false messiah, saying that Jesus' father was a Roman soldier. I used to dismiss such stories as ancient slander, yet while we do not know what happened, there are too many points of circumstantial evidence to simply ignore them. The name Panthera, sometimes spelled differently in ancient sources, may refer to a panther skin that certain soldiers wore. The discovery of a grave of a Roman soldier named Tiberius Panthera, member of a cohort of Syrian archers stationed in Palestine in the 1st century, might support those ancient rumors. Seriously, let's talk about those so-called sources. The Panthera theory comes from Celsus, a 2nd century critic who claimed his mother was turned out by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery. She had a child by a certain soldier named Panthera. Celsus wasn't exactly an unbiased historian. He was trolling Christians and got his info from Jews who hated Christians. He wrote over 100 years after Jesus, far removed from the events, with zero first-hand knowledge or credible sources. As Robert Van Voorst puts it, Celsus's treatment of Christ is polemical and tendentious, adding, it is of little value in our knowledge of the historical Jesus. He also notes that while Panthera was a common name among Roman soldiers, many believed it was used as a pun on Parthenos, the Greek word for virgin, in reaction to the Christian doctrine of the virgin birth. Origen, who preserved and refuted Celsus's claim, dismissed it as nonsense, pointing out that it was a baseless attempt to undermine the virgin birth. He called it absurd that someone capable of such mighty acts would have such a disgraceful origin. Next up, we have the Talmud. Pagels seems to lean on it too, but here's the deal. The Talmud wasn't compiled until centuries after Jesus' life, and its accounts are riddled with contradictions. Sanhedrin 67a says, was he the son of Stata or Pandera? His mother Miriam was unfaithful to her husband. Shabbat 104b says, his mother Miriam, the hairdresser, committed adultery. But the biggest facepalm is, the Talmud places Jesus in the completely wrong century. Sanhedrin 107b and Soda 47a describe him as a disciple of Joshua ben Perahiah, who lived 100 to 150 years before Jesus was ever born. As Van Voorst says, a chain of tradition from the 1st century would have set this error straight. Instead, these slanders reflect 2nd and 3rd century Jewish polemics, not authentic 1st century history. And yet, Pagels wants us to take the grave of a Roman soldier named Tiberius Panthera as circumstantial evidence. Really, even if the name Panthera wasn't super rare, this doesn't prove he had anything to do with Mary or Jesus. It is a massive leap with zero corroborating evidence. This is some Billy Carson level scholarship here. But wait, Pagels takes it a step further, suggesting that if Panthera was involved, it might have been a case of rape. She cites Josephus, who describes Roman soldiers brutalizing Galilee and families worrying about their daughter's safety. Sure, the Romans were indeed awful, but claiming Roman soldiers committed crimes in the area, so this must have happened, is pure conjecture, not evidence. Even a skeptical New Testament scholar like James Tabor points out that, quote, at the time of Jesus' birth, nearly 2 years before Herod's death in 4 BCE, there were no disturbances in Galilee to suggest women were being raped. Roman soldiers weren't stationed in Sepphoris or Nazareth, but in Syria under Varus. Herod firmly controlled the region during Jesus' birth. Pagels also assumes that Matthew and Luke made up their accounts to cover Mary's shameful past because their stories differ and because Mark doesn't mention Joseph or the virgin birth. But this is just a whopper of a weak argument from silence, and I've tackled this in other videos. As for the contradictory accounts, D.A. Carson explains, stories in the infancy narratives have long been shown to be compatible, even mutually complementary. Matthew focuses largely on Joseph, Luke on Mary. Skeptical scholars like Raymond Brown do not accept this because they find it inconceivable that Joseph could have had told his story without mentioning the Annunciation, or that Mary could have passed on her story without mentioning the flight to Egypt. True enough, though it does not follow that the evangelists were bound to include all they knew. Matthew was prepared to omit things that he knew in order to present his chosen themes coherently and concisely. So Carson hits the nail on the head. Matthew and Luke's differences just show that they're telling the story from different angles. Matthew focuses on Joseph, Luke on Mary, and leaving stuff out does not mean that they're just making things up. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke affirm the virgin birth and are packed with verifiable historical details, names, places, and customs that align with archaeology and other historical records. Compare that to Celsus's trolling or the Talmud's contradictions and a random Roman grave. This is not Ivy League scholarship. This is clickbait for Christmas.